Hi, welcome to this video. Tonight I'm going to talk about stages of awakening. So there are a lot of different ways to approach this topic. There are many different descriptions in various systems. Zen has more than one set of descriptions about the different stages along the path of realization. And in other systems, there are descriptions and stages, etc. Um, I want to, before I go into detail about this, I want to say a couple of things about the approach I will take tonight. First of all, it's going to be very concise, so I'm not going to go into great detail. I want to just give it sort of a general overview. In a later series of videos, I probably will give more in depth description of each level, each stage, and how things are approached at those stages and the pitfalls and challenges that come with those stages. But for tonight, this is more of a sort of an overview to give anyone who's interested a feel of how these stages play out. A couple other things I want to say about this. One is that uh, it's important to understand that there are many different ways to talk about this. People who have had some experience of this or have had deep stage realization even will describe this differently. So, and this is for a couple different reasons. First of all, people have a different style of speaking and they use different words based on which system they might have grown up in or have been involved in. So, for instance, in Zen Buddhism, say two people who have had awakenings or can show experience in Zen Buddhism and have been practicing for 10 or 12 years, they might use relatively similar words to talk about their awakening experience. They might use similar terms. They might understand it in a relatively similar framework. Now, if you ask them individually, they may actually, and you really push for what was it actually like in the moment, in the momentary experience. They may give you different descriptions. If they are really pushed to use their own words and not use, Zen terminology and so forth. But in general, you're going to get a relatively similar type of description. In a different sect of Buddhism, they may have a totally different way of talking about realization and awakening. And say in Hinduism or Christian mysticism, there may be very different ways of talking about realization and awakening as well. So the first reason that there's going to be quite a bit of variation out there in the way people talk about these this realization process is that different systems have different sets of terminology, and we are, thinking creatures. We have a very complex neurologic system sitting on top of our shoulders and incorporated in the entire body. Actually, that is very good at pattern recognition, recording data, and recalling data. So yeah, when it's been exposed to a certain set of principles and descriptions, it tends to sort of stick to that description at least for a while after realization. So you will find that there's variation based on what systems people have come up in or been exposed to or what books they've read, or whether they haven't woken up inside of any specific system at all, but maybe around a certain teacher or even on their own, may just describe things very differently. Another reason that there's quite a bit of difference in descriptions about how awakenings play out and what they are like experientially among people who have had the experiences of them is that it's a more intimate, fundamental reason, and that is that we have different proclivities, different ways of viewing reality, the different ways of viewing ourselves, different ways of and different language sets, of course, based on how we grew up, the words we use, the cultures we grew up in. But even deeper than that, our emotion states, our emotion body, how we relate to emotions and how we relate to the world and others. All of these things are very individual, and those individual differences will make a big difference on or in not only how we talk about realization and awakening, but whether we're even inclined to talk about it at all. So many people will not even, people who've gone through realization and gone through awakening may not even talk about it. They may not even use the terminology at all. So they may not use any terminology. They may not say I've had an awakening. They may just not even feel totally disinclined to speak about it. And that makes quite a difference in what you'll hear out there especially in the spiritual community about awakening. And then I would say even a third thing that affects the variation is that I think just the terminology or the term awakening itself has become sort of widespread in pop culture, and it means different things, but specific to an actual awakening in the way I'm going to define it or describe it, it's still relatively rarely properly used in that sense. I think it's fine how anyone uses any word. There's no rules about that, of course, and however people choose to apply the word awakening or awake is fine. But I think it gets misused a lot, or not used in an accurate way that might be described by like a realized Zen master, or somebody who has gone through realization themselves. And so it can get used in ways that are just basically confusing. So with all of those sort of aspects to the differences in the way people communicate about realization and the awakening process, if you go out and try to research it or get on the internet or ask 20 people about it, you're going to get 20 different answers. You're going to find hundreds or thousands of web pages that describe all kinds of different things. So there's quite a bit of variation. So then the question is, well, what do I have to offer? Well, I can talk about it actually from a few different angles, from different sort of paradigms, and I often do when I'm talking to people. It comes up completely spontaneously. I don't think about how I'm going to approach a certain conversation with somebody when it comes to this type of context. It's very intuitive, it's instinctual, and it happens in the moment. But there are different paradigms that can be used to sort of point to these stages. They're all analogies, right? Anything I use to talk about stages of awakening or realization is an analogy. So it's a model, a way of pointing. So I can approach it from different angles at different times. And tonight I'm just going to be pretty simple and straightforward about it. But I also want to point out that I'm not trying to suggest that I have a better way to describe it than anybody else, that my way is correct, or that you should adopt the way I'm going to describe it in this video as your own map or litmus test. That's not actually the intention at all. Like any video I make in this setting about awakening, I'm really just pointing. The words are sort of an excuse to convey a sort of a subtext. So I'm actually using the stages as a way of pointing, and pointing really here just means that by describing things a certain way, or sometimes it'll happen, a resonation will happen where the words I'm using may cause some sort of a resonation in you that sort of reminds you and makes you pause, gives you pause, and then there's a sense of something opening, an opening to a different type of experience, the kind of experience that's not something you have to think about or ponder. Is this the right experience, or question? It's just immediate and intimate, that kind of direct experience. So these words are really always pointing to that in one way or another. And realization is sort of the ultimate direct experience. That it's when that direct experience isn't a momentary experience. That direct experience is something that is seen to be infinite, and it's also seen to be intertwined with your own identity initially. So ultimately, this is just a pointing. I don't expect anybody to walk away from this with a new map or paradigm about a roadmap to realization that they're going to plan out over the next 5 years of their life. That's not at all the intention here. So really, it's sort of falls into a few segments. So there's sort of what happens before an initial awakening, okay, before what I would generally just call awakening or first awakening, or Zen would call it kensho. Some people also call it awakening to the sense of I am. So there's sort of this segment or part of the pathless path that comes before that awakening. And then there's that awakening, the initial awakening, and it's a tremendous shift in identity. It's something that is beyond any kind of conceptual paradigm shift you've ever had about yourself. It's the most fundamental transformation up until that point you've had in your life, without a doubt. And anybody who has gone through this knows that's true. It's very fundamental. And the shift is a shift in consciousness from a dividing conceptual sense of self and other to a non-conceptual, undivided, sort of a universal or oceanic sense of being, of sometimes it feels like an I that doesn't have a conjugate, an I that doesn't have an object. So it's sort of all subject, just pure, wherever you go, there you already are. Pure consciousness, pure being. So this is this first awakening. And as transformative and life-altering as this is for anyone who's had it, and it's still relatively rare. I think there are probably more people who sort of think and suspect they might have had it, than actually have. And that's good news if that's you, because there's something pretty amazing awaiting, right? So if you're willing to really dig in. So this is the first awakening, and I'll describe this in more detail. I'm just kind of giving the layout. So there's the phase before, and then there's the first awakening. And that really is, you could almost say, the birth of the awakening process, or the birth of the process of liberation, of realization. It's the beginning of sort of the road to liberation, and the road is not a road in time. It's a road out of time. So then there's the awakening process itself, or the awakening is not even a process, it's a moment. It's a fraction. It doesn't even take a moment, actually. And then there's sort of what follows that immediately. There's almost a honeymoon period right after it, typically. And then there's sort of the post-awakening stage, or set of stages that comes after the awakening has happened and life has changed dramatically and fundamentally. But it still goes on. You don't typically go live under a bridge or join a monastery. Most people these days don't do that. When that happens, you actually continue to live and become more serious about truth, living truth, digging into your own deepest truth, to the deepest truth of life, and you have more of it comes with it. You can't not have it. You have more of a commitment to that, like it or not. You might not describe it that way, but you will. And so there's this post-awakening period. And this could be divided up into sort of sub-phases or sub-segments, but ultimately it takes some time typically, but not always. I've seen this whole process happen in 18 months from initial contact with somebody who was all about waking up to awakening, and then beyond awakening to the post-awakening process to what I would call liberation, which is sort of that. It's when the initial awakening is seen and lived on a moment-to-moment basis. And as I said, awakening itself is still relatively rare, but it's becoming much more common, I think. Seems to be. And it's quite available. It's quite available to anybody. It's available to you. It's available to anybody. But as I said, it's still relatively uncommon. But liberation is far more uncommon. So I think a lot of people who have had an awakening and many of them don't even know that it was called an awakening. They wouldn't put it in a spiritual context. They wouldn't describe it as I'm describing it, but they absolutely know a fundamental shift has happened. And for some people, it's really terrifying, scary. They don't know what it was. They don't understand it, misinterpret it, and it can become actually quite terrifying afterwards for some people, depending on the situation and the makeup. But yeah, after the awakening happens, there's this post-awakening period where I think for the majority of people, probably still who have an awakening, it doesn't go far beyond that, which is fine. It's not a bad way to live, but 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 we all sort of know once we've had an awakening, we know that there's some process that's underway, and if we're really honest with ourselves, the only thing we can do really by applying effort is to slow it down. We can't actually stop it. Well, we can slow it down. We can hold it off, it seems like. And we won't know we're doing that. We'll think we're actually trying to make the process, to accelerate the process or get to the next stage. And sometimes we'll think that's what we're doing. We're actually doing the opposite. We're holding ourselves up or getting in our own way. But after an awakening, almost by definition, there's a knowing somewhere. There's a deep knowing that there's another possibility beyond that initial awakening, what was glimpsed. And in that glimpse, it wasn't just a little taste. It was a shift in our identity. There's a knowing beyond that little taste is actually everything. It's everything. It's the entire world of experience. That is its nature, and that it doesn't actually come and go. I'm hesitant to say it in this way, that you can get to a place where it's a permanent experience for you, but that's really not the right way to talk about it, because it's not an experience and there's nothing permanent when that happens. But there is a possibility where that awakening, the salient feature of that awakening is lived and fully integrated into life. And I would call that liberation. And actually, there are stages beyond that, but I probably won't go into that here. So I wanted to describe these sort of segments in general, and then probably cut it off there, and maybe in a later series we can talk more in detail about each phase. So this first phase, this pre-awakening phase, it's kind of like life as usual. But there's a big variation here too. Like, I have met people who were spiritual seekers, who are devout Zen Buddhists, who work hard, meditate. They know what awakening is, and they're out to get it. They're working towards it, And and then there are people who I've met, strangely, who have been pushing up against it their entire life and had no idea, that are literally like ready to just walk off the edge. Truly, literally, energetically ready to just walk off the edge, and they have no spiritual context. They don't even know what the word awakening means. They don't know what that means, and I don't have to teach it to them at all. The conversation is very immediate, intuitive, and energetically clear to them. And people that I've met in those situations often wake up very quickly, like very, very quickly. So understand that there's a huge variation in the way you might perceive spirituality or awakening in this pre-awakening phase. So if you're somebody who knows what it is and that's what you want to wake up, you want to have that I am awakening happen for you, and you're working hard and you're meditating, that's great. But understand there are also people for whom, for whatever reason, we can talk about karma or we can talk about conditions, but for some reason they have gone through this life and they've felt their entire life deconstructing. As they become an adult, they've also felt their life just deconstructing. They say things like, I've felt like an alien my whole life. I've always known something was different. I always thought there was something wrong with me because I felt so different than everyone else. And they're usually tremendously relieved when I say, actually, no, there's nothing wrong with you. That's what this is. I don't have to say it's called awakening. I can say you can trust it. You can trust these movements, and we can describe those movements that are happening inside, in the thoughts and the emotion body and the sort of energy field, if you will. And they get it intuitively, very quickly and obviously. And it's a huge relief for someone to just say, yes, that's exactly what's supposed to be happening. Exactly. So yeah, this pre-awakening stage has quite a variation in sort of how people perceive what's going on for them. Um, so you could have a spiritual identity, you could have none at all. You could have knowledge about awakening, you could have none at all. And I can't even tell you by experience now whether one's better or worse as far as increasing your chances of awakening, because they both seem to lead to awakening. So, but the sort of salient feature of this phase, okay, is recognizing, something isn't quite right with life, okay? And it's not a negative attitude so much. It's something, the ways I've learned to understand life, to the ways I've been taught to understand myself, to navigate life, the ways I've been taught to plan for the future and solve problems, and just be a human, and the ways we just talk to each other on a day-to-day basis. Somehow those aren't quite right. There's something not right about that. There's not something not right about the way it makes me feel, or there's something about me internally, this body mind, this set of emotions, the way this mind processes, the way this body moves through life. There's something not quite right about it. Something. This is in Buddhism. The first noble truth is life is suffering, or dukkha. So that's what suffering means in this context. It doesn't mean pain, physical pain, or someone's torturing you. It means a fundamental sense that something is not right. And that can manifest in different ways. But like I said, I've had people tell me I've just felt like an alien all my life. And these aren't people with mental illness. This is somebody who's relatively functional, lives, outwardly normal life, goes to work, goes to school. A lot of people are very high functioning, get good grades, all that. You don't have to be, of course, but it's not a mental illness when someone says I've felt like an alien, or I don't know how to talk about what people talk about. I don't know how to be a human. When someone says that to me, I don't think it's weird, and I don't think they're mentally ill. I hear exactly what they're saying. I know almost certainly what they mean. And I know that feeling, and it's in a sense it's a really miserable feeling, but for me it was terrible. It was torture. It was actually torture to live inside of a conceptual mind for me before an initial awakening many years ago. Brutal, but looking back, it was also the best thing that was in me at those times, because it is the impetus to wake up. It's the match that lights the fire, the transformational fire of awakening or enlightenment. So suffering, that kind of suffering, it leads to awakening, and that's usually that first stage. Is somewhere in life we pick something up, something doesn't feel right, or we're just suffering a lot, or often we get exposed to something, an Eastern religion. For me, it was like an Eastern philosophy, Eastern religion. It was just fascinating to me. I didn't know why. And then I started hearing a few things, and then I kind of heard things from people who were clearly had realization or enlightenment or awakening. And I could tell by their words, like, okay, they're talking about something different than anyone talks about. Okay. So, but the clues can come to you from a lot of different sources. It can be literally just from something someone says out of the blue. A couple words that just click in the brain right. Can be an experience. People have these experiences even with like psychedelic drugs, or walking in nature, and you can just have an experience of mystical expansiveness or interconnectedness with the entire universe. You get a taste of that for 1 second, and it's really hard to ignore for the rest of your life that you know what that was. So yeah, somehow you get a clue, right? There's often this combination of suffering, this magical combination of suffering, or this something is not right. Something isn't right with the way I think, with the way these thoughts seem to enclose me in a prison. And people just say, oh, well, just stay busy, or all the normal coping mechanisms people tell you, exercise, you see that they're not going to work. You can feel, at least for you, they may work for other people, but for you, no, that's not getting to the core of what is bothering me. Right? It's a pebble in your shoe you can't ignore. So there's a magic combination of that kind of suffering, that angst, and somehow this message comes to you, or you find it. Maybe you watch a Zen Tay show, or you see now there's stuff online, you can watch non-duality videos or something someone says and it clicks and you're like, whoa, okay, that's different. That's what I've had people tell me this in so many different ways. I might say something very simple to somebody and they'll say, that's exactly what I've been looking for my entire life. And I'm like, what did I say? I was talking about emotions or something, and they know that's their path. They'll say, that's my path. This is my path. I've had people say that who have no spiritual background. This is my path, with a very short conversation, a few sentences. And they know there's something intuitive moving forward in you. It's like you didn't even know it was there until it woke up in you and just started speaking for you in a way. It says, hey, this is my path. I want to learn whatever. I want to sit in the Zendo and I want to learn a koan. I want to work on mu, or I want to get close to a certain teacher that I know I can feel the transmission in them already. I want to start talking to them and asking them questions or whatever. Maybe you read it in a book, or who knows? It can happen anywhere. Maybe it happens in church. It can happen, you're reading a passage in the Bible or something. And something tells you there's something more. So now there's a combination of that. The sense that something wasn't right, the way you were living, understanding yourself, relating to yourself and the world and others, was something not right about it, not completely authentic, or not, it just didn't feel right. That combination of that and now, but there's this other thing now. I can feel it. I know it's here. It's here. It's very real, more real than real. That's that taste you get. Okay. I might call that something like recognition. Okay. It's not an awakening, but maybe I would call it recognition. And I can look back through my life and see that happened a few different times at different levels. And you may not even completely understand when that happens. You won't look at that and go, oh, this is that moment that I've defined my path in life. That may not happen to you, but the seed is planted. You'll feel something in the moment for sure. And then you might sort of forget about it, or you might talk yourself out of thinking that was important, but it doesn't actually matter because the seed's planted. And again, just like before, when that something came up from inside of you and became more aware, more alive, more alert, it may go dormant again, but it'll come back, right? That the seed is planted, something's growing. And then it can play out different ways. You can sort of spontaneously walk into an awakening. I've seen that happen. You may meet a teacher and start talking or interacting in a very direct way about realization, or you may have a practice where you sit, meditate, work on a koan with a Zen teacher, read a lot. Maybe you read Buddhist texts, you read Dogen, or whatever you resonate with. Who knows? Prayer. There's a lot of ways to go about this. So then you start working at it, or opening yourself to it, or dedicating yourself to it, or just completely surrendering to it. But you, one way or another, you orient yourself to that, what has moved up and through you that seemed dormant up until that moment. Maybe it didn't come from inside. It seemed like it came from outside, somewhere the universe touched you, whatever. However you might think about that or experience it. But you start to orient yourself to that. You start to maybe trust it, even though you have no freaking clue what it is. It doesn't make sense. No one, your friends don't know what you're talking about. You can't even put it into words, but it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. It's more real than words. It's more real than concepts. It's more real than the dividing, thought process goes on all day describing this and that concept. It's more real than all that, and you know it. But you have no idea how you're going to find it. You have no idea how you're going to actualize it, but you know it's possible somehow. But you might doubt it's possible too. That's okay. There's plenty of doubt often. It's something you're pushed, or something pushes you, or you push yourself, and you move towards that somehow, or you open to it. Okay, it might feel more like an opening and a surrender. It might feel more like a pushing or an insistence, or it might feel strangely like both. All right, so this is that first stage in kind of two steps. The first step is sort of the suffering, or something's not quite right, and then there's this maybe recognition of something different, something more real, more vast than you've encountered, something very much alive, and then an orientation towards it. That's kind of the next half of this first stage. You start to orient towards that, and that can manifest in different ways. Like I said, having a teacher, reading books about it, watching non-duality videos. There's many ways this plays out. Some people just need to be in nature. They walk in nature through service. There's probably infinite ways, but it's what resonates with you, and what this inner voice that starts to move through you, that starts to orient you. It's what that how that leads you. Okay, and so then you start working towards it, or working towards nothing, or letting go, or however you might describe it or experience it. But um, but now at some point there'll be an awakening, and it can come out of the blue. Some people have it; they wake up in the middle of the night, and it just totally overcomes them. I've known people who it happened to in the shower. Um, Sometimes it sort of happens, and everything just gets so incredibly quiet that there's no thinking, there's no thoughts, so you don't even know it happened for a minute. And then there's this tremendous emotional outflow of just freedom like you've never felt, a tremendous release, like you've been carrying a 100-pound bag on your back and you didn't even know it, and someone just pulls it off you and drops it on the ground, and you can move so freely. The mind is free. There's no other anymore. There's no conflict anymore. You know it. You know fundamentally, in the most fundamental sense of reality, there's no conflict. You touch into that, and there's just no doubt. And not only is it's not an experience. The point is you experience it in yourself, in what you are. But what you are changes. It expands, I would say. So yeah, this happens all different ways. For me, it happened while I was meditating, and then kind of happened in two phases, but years ago. Um, and this is a big shift in what you take yourself to be. One way I describe it sometimes is you could describe a lot of different shifts in the way you think about life that you've gone through, right? As you mature through life and become an adolescent and then an adult, you have different paradigm shifts in how you experience reality, how you experience yourself, new experiences in life, maybe even traumas in life. These all shift your perception in certain ways, right? They shift. You see life differently. You shift to this perception and then that perspective, maybe bigger perspectives, right? As we mature, we get more bigger perspectives. We're comfortable with more. This shift is a different type of shift fundamentally. This is not a shift in what you're sort of looking at or the paradigm you're experiencing out there. The shift is what is looking through your eyes. What is looking out is what changes or what shifts. And you can't imagine how that is. It's not imaginable because it's not in the world of imagination. It's not in thoughts. But it's a huge relief when it's sensed. It's like, oh, okay. And it's always been like this. That's the funny thing. It feels completely natural. You almost feel like you remember it, like as from a childhood. But it's not. Memory is too impermanent. This isn't like that. This is like, it's kind of like always there, And there's just a sense of familiarity, of peace. And for a long time, not for a long time, I should say, most people, for a good amount of time, days, weeks, sometimes months, will feel just overwhelming peace. And they move through life with a spontaneity that they barely remember from early childhood, when they had no worries in the world. A wonder, a mystery, things are just alive. Everything. You're fascinated with everything. All the agendas you had, right before the awakening, gone. You're not after anything anymore. You don't think you need anything anymore. The dream that I need to solve all these problems is gone. There's no problems to solve. They're just vaporized. It's very, very peaceful. Okay. So that's and if that's not satisfying, I understand. I can talk more in detail about what actually happened, what the awakening is. But I think in the scope of this video, because this might drag out a bit, I'm going to move past that. But let me just say it's a fundamental shift in what you take yourself to be, where you derive identity, and from a very small, threatened, constantly moving, shifting place to something that's sort of always there. And some people call this the sense of I am, or a sense of pure I. Like I am, and you don't have to say I am a person, I am a man, I am a woman, I am a older person, I am a younger person, I am a religious person, I am a non-religious person. None of those apply. It's just I am. So whatever situation seems to arise, it's already I am. It's already there. It's already you. And it just feels like finally in life, you don't feel threatened by life at a very fundamental level. So that's the shift. I would call first awakening, again called Kensho in Zen, or different things, but awakening. So then, relatively soon after that, but again, there's often this pretty amazing honeymoon. But pretty soon after that, you start to realize, like, okay, now you got some work to do. And really what that means is that the living truth of awakeness has been glimpsed. Not just glimpsed, you've sort of shifted into it. But all of the habits that have been obscuring it all this time aren't gone. In fact, they're completely intact still. So that's frustrating. Most people find this phase frustrating because you start to have to face them all. Okay, you have to face all of the ways that we hide from life, hide from ourselves, the ways we distract ourselves. Start to face our amazing ability to run from our own emotions, face those resistance patterns, and then the emotions themselves, and start to embody the emotion body, those deeper centers within us that we've been using these fractured identities to run from without knowing that's what we were doing. So now it's kind of like there's no hiding anymore, right? And even as these sort of more painful experiences come to the surface, there's always, even though sometimes we sort of forget it, there's always this background sense of peace. This is now happening in a vessel that's safe. It's happening in an infinite, really, vessel of okayness or all rightness. And this shift into that vessel of vastness, of okayness, of peace, is what allows us actually to finally come to terms with all these delusions, these tendencies, these habits of hiding, of lying, of manipulating, of all these things we do subconsciously. We're not mean, evil people doing it on purpose, but communication patterns with ourselves, with others, repressed emotions, all this, we have to face it all. We know that. And we try to run from it sometimes, all of us will try to run from it at one point or another. But at this point, it doesn't matter. It sort of comes for you. So that life will move you from situation to situation to experience what's necessary to start to face all of these distortions. Okay, and you could describe sub phases throughout a lot of this, or sub stages that sort of occur. But in general, it's really just about clear seeing of everything. Everything that's hidden will be seen. Everything that's been repressed will come to the surface, like everything, right? The last thing you ever wanted to face, things like shame, guilt, helplessness, fear of all of those, fear of humiliation, all of it, it's all coming for you, right? Doesn't mean it's going to play out in your life, although sometimes it will. Mostly if you repress it, that's when it plays out in your life. But if you accept it, if you're willing to just go there, to just let these emotion states be what they are, come to the surface, drift around in your consciousness here and there, things will go well. Ultimately, it's really about resistance or not resistance. The more resistance you apply to this process, the more painful it will be, to the point where some people just don't even understand this. They don't know. They don't have this advice, and they really resist this. I mean, really resist this. It's like not funny. It's terrifying for them. Very, 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 very painful. Excruciatingly painful. You're fighting the most powerful force there is. So when this process starts to play out, my best advice is don't fight it. Let it play out. It's okay. You can trust it. You can trust every emotion that arises within you. It's all okay. You can trust seeing every delusion that you've been hiding behind, or every strange thought process that's been moving through. all of those fears of abandonment, fears of intimacy, all these things, they're all going to come up, right? Because we share them all. Yeah, they feel really personal until you really start to allow them into consciousness, into your own experience, and then you realize, oh wow, like we all share these. There's actually nothing personal. These are shared communication, shared habituation of emotion patterns that we share among each other with certain communications, and it sort of reinforces them. So, but this thing about shame and hiding really keeps them sort of in the unconscious, or it's not this mysterious place, the unconscious. It keeps them unconscious through activity, actually, through a certain activity of thinking and competing identities, and a lot of distraction. We live in a world and society of distraction, so that's pretty obvious. So yeah, these hidden places will come to the surface. They will all be seen, all brought into consciousness. And as this happens, the whole thought world you used to think you lived in before the first awakening, that has sort of calmed down and coalesced into this field of consciousness, this oceanic field of consciousness, and some people call this being, like infinite being. Okay, that's what they're talking about, whether they realize it or not. They're talking about consciousness, this vast this field of consciousness. That consciousness itself starts to just calm down more and more and more until, there's still thoughts. There can still be thoughts. Very rarely would the thoughts just disappear at this stage, but they could. But typically there will be still thoughts, but they're very quickly embraced and not sort of, we don't have an unhealthy relationship with thoughts, or it happens less and less, to the point where this consciousness is sort of just constant. It's just this oceanic fluctuation of consciousness is sort of always there with us, whether we're meditating or walking around talking to people, or it may kind of obscure itself here and there, but ultimately we realize what we realized in the first awakening is that we are consciousness. That's the identity shifted from fractured subject-object consciousness to consciousness itself, to vast oceanic consciousness. And that looks like the world. Everything you've ever experienced is this consciousness, this reflective consciousness. Okay, it's reflective. That's its nature. So now things get kind of weird. Not in a bad way, in a good way, but in a very hard to describe way. When we really start getting interested in the nature of this consciousness, this sense of I am, without thoughts. This isn't a conceptual I. This is the sense of I, this vast oceanic I, or this vast oceanic pure conscious state, which is not really a state, it's just a fluctuating experience of interconnected knowing or reflection. And it literally is everything. It's everything you know. It's everything you could possibly experience. The world, all sensation is in this reflection. Okay. And then we, at some point, it can happen earlier or later, we start to experience something, let's say, beyond that consciousness. This gets very, very hard to talk about. And not because it's not obvious, it's actually more obvious than anything now. It's more obvious than the consciousness, but it's so far from anything that can be conceptualized or described. And it's not because it's distant either, because it's so close. It's so fundamental to reality, to what makes reality reality, that it's very hard to talk about or describe. But we start to become aware of it, and then we start to recognize that consciousness itself, the whole, what we would call our world, or the world, life, others, ourself, thoughts, beliefs, the future, the past, all that, that's really just one gate, one sense gate, let's say. And then we start to recognize the pure senses, which are very fundamentally different experientially than the reflected senses, as the way consciousness puts them together. So color, sound, taste, sensation, smell. We start to get glimpses of these in their pure form, which again is very, very challenging to describe, but I can't describe it. It's not, wouldn't say it's an extremely good experience because it's not in the realm of good or bad. It's nothing like that. But it's very right. It has a very real, more real than real flavor to it. It's incredibly immediate. It's so immediate that you don't need to approach it. You could never be apart from it. Nothing could ever be apart from it. So this sense world that we have thought we've known for so long, we've actually been ignoring by putting all of our attention into thought and consciousness. And we start to become directly aware of it. We start to recognize, in a sense, you could say, what the reflective mirror of consciousness has been reflecting. And we recognize that the reflection itself is only a reflection. But the only way we can formulate a world, a self, an other, an event, time, the only way we can formulate that is through consciousness itself. So you can see how hard it gets to talk about what is even more fundamental or what is reflected in the consciousness itself. You could say that we start to recognize that there is only reflection, or that the reflection itself, the reflecting of itself is what's real. But I'm not talking about that as an object to a thinker, or an object to a watcher, or an object to an experiencer. It's as if the identity that consciousness seems to contain is also seen to be sort of an illusion, you could say. And what's real is so primary, so direct and immediate, so intimate, so vivid, but it's also without specific essence. Now that seems to be a contradiction, and to the mind that it would be a contradiction, that it has no essence, and you could say it's empty, but it's also vivid and all-encompassing and intimate beyond description. Those seem like opposites, but they're not opposites. They're actually, it has to be both aspects, and then it's seen to not be aspects. I have to approach it by talking about it like aspects because I'm using words, but they're not aspects. Empty fullness. This is where we start talking in very strange terminology, right? Empty fullness. Everything and nothing. But again, this is not meant to be describing an altered consciousness, a shift in consciousness, because there are many, 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 many shifts in consciousness that can happen before awakening and even after awakening that will feel like, oh my God, I had this mystical experience. I had Buddha appeared before me and I started having visions, and very, very, very pleasant experiences can happen within consciousness. This is not in that realm. This is beyond, is not the right word. It's more fundamental even than consciousness. Where consciousness now is experienced almost as a sense itself, just at one sense. But again, everything's a paradox now. When you recognize that distinctness of consciousness and the distinctness of red, black, shape, movement, color, and sound, when you recognize their vivid distinctness and their radical aliveness, then they're actually not separate. So again, another paradox, but that's when we start to experience what I might call interpenetration or interconnectedness. And it's as if there is no outside. There's no possibility of other. Everything is that immediate. Everything is that as is, simply as it is. When it is, it is. When it's not, it's not. It's a direct, immediate, closer than close, intimate, nothing left out. That's the experience of the sense world now. We're talking about liberation now. When it's seen that is the fundamental nature of the way things are. But it's not a belief. You don't know that. It's the moment to moment flow is that. And again, in another way this gets hard to talk about, another paradox here is that what I would probably say the mark of this transformation is what I would call transience. And this is one of those things that, again, is just words, it defies words. You would imagine it's something like everything's always changing, but then to imagine that it's like there's a background to which it's changing, but it's much more like all of reality is simply rearranging itself. Like the deck is just being shuffled moment to moment. So in this moment, all these descriptions, the way this is even experienced, even in direct experience by nobody, self-experiencing, will be completely different than in the next minute, in a fundamental way. At the level of identity, it will be literally gone, and something else will be there, you could say. So reality is no specific way. It's too free to be any specific way. And this is not a belief. I've said that, I know I keep saying that, but it's important because the mind will keep wanting to make a map out of this. This is not a map. This isn't some belief system I have. It's not like that at all. It's the most obvious thing in the world. It's more obvious than the world. It's more obvious than the sun when you're looking right at it. Transience. So, and also that might sound, I don't know how it sounds. It could sound uncomfortable maybe to somebody, like you can't hold on to anything or there's no continuity. But when you see that there was no one to lose that continuity in the first place, there was nothing holding on to that continuity, there was nothing that could be continuous, then it's seen that that sense of continuity was always a burden. You were trying to hold on to something that could never be. And so it might sound uncomfortable or undesirable, but in direct experience, transience is freedom, infinite degree freedom. And it's not freedom for you. It is the nature of, we could say, reality. It's just the freedom to be without nature, to be of any nature. So you can see I struggle with these descriptions because it's not describable. That's the beauty of it. Even if you could describe it elegantly, eloquently, perfectly in the moment, those sensory phenomenon fluctuating within one another and experiencing them only themselves and simultaneously disappearing out of reality or whatever. Even if you could describe that in one moment, in the next moment it's completely gone. That reality is not, because there is no universal reality. So universality goes away. I don't know if that sounds bad, but again, in direct experience, it's just another degree of freedom. And not just freedom, but intimacy and peace. So that's more liberation stage. And again, even at liberation stage, people would describe that even more differently. Some people would never ever describe it as liberation. They wouldn't even say anything happened to them. They wouldn't even talk about it. They just live, or maybe they teach in a different way, or they transmit in a certain way, but won't even talk about liberation as such. Some people do. So the ways people would communicate about what I'm describing vary tremendously. But hopefully this gives you at least a sense of some of these stages. And again, beyond this liberation that I'm describing, there are movements that clarify even more. So it's quite a thing. So what's available to anybody is just beyond imagination. It's a life of freedom beyond imagination. My teacher once said, I'll tell this whole story at a different time, but this is a long video. My teacher, years ago, I had a Zen teacher, and he said, he was talking about this thing called the 10 Oxford pictures, which is sort of another way of describing stages of enlightenment. And he said, if you can even sense these later stages of enlightenment, I don't want anyone to ever think that, that couldn't happen to me in this lifetime. He said, if you can even sense it, even just get a little sense or glimpse of maybe what that might even be talking about, it's completely available to you in this lifetime. And he lived his life and worked as if that was true. And nothing I've seen so far, has told me he was wrong. In fact, the more this goes on, the more it confirms he's absolutely right. And there are no barriers. There's no number of lifetimes you need. Okay, so forget about it. This is all available to you. I wouldn't be taking time to make these videos. So hopefully that was helpful. Let me know if you have comments, questions, or want more clarification on any of that. Good night.